Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into the financial systems of three major Islamic empires and uncovering some of their hidden intricacies. This topic might challenge some perspectives, and that is okay if you disagree or have something to add. The comment section is open for discussion. So, let's get started. Islamic finance is built on the strict prohibition of riba, or interest, as outlined in the Quran and Hadith. However, historical realities often led Islamic states to navigate complex financial transactions that at times resembled riba. In this video, we will explore how three major Islamic empires, the Umayyads, Abbasids, and Ottomans, handled this issue, the exact mechanisms they used, and how scholars of the time justified or condemned these practices. But first, let us take a moment to understand exactly what riba is, and why it is considered one of the most serious prohibitions in Islam. In Islamic finance, riba refers to any form of unlawful, predetermined increase in a loan or financial transaction. The Quran explicitly condemns riba, stating in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah has permitted trade and has forbidden riba. Islamic finance prohibits these practices because they exploit the financially vulnerable and disrupt economic justice. However, as we will see in this video, historical Islamic states sometimes found ways to work around these restrictions, whether through necessity, legal loopholes, or alternative interpretations of Islamic law. The Umayyads were the first dynasty to rule the Islamic world after the Rashidun caliphs, and they faced a rapidly expanding economy. As trade and commerce flourished, so did financial transactions that sometimes involved riba. While the caliphate officially prohibited usury, historical evidence suggests that it existed in indirect forms. One of the most well-documented cases is the reliance on non-Muslim moneylenders, primarily Jews and Christians, who were exempt from Islamic financial restrictions. In cities like Damascus and Kufa, Jewish and Christian financiers provided loans to Muslim merchants, often with interest. Since these groups were dhimmis, which were protected non-Muslims, some Umayyad rulers tolerated this practice, arguing that Islamic law did not apply to them. One example is Khalid ibn Yazid, a prominent Umayyad prince who was known for his patronage of financial sciences. While he never explicitly promoted riba, he engaged with scholars who studied Greek and Roman financial systems, which included interest-based transactions. Some scholars, like Atta ibn Abi Rabah, condemned these practices, warning that allowing indirect forms of riba through non-Muslim lenders was still a violation of Islamic law. Others, like al-Zuri, took a more pragmatic stance, acknowledging that economic needs sometimes made it unavoidable. As the Abbasid Empire expanded, its economy became more sophisticated. The introduction of financial instruments such as sak, which are checks, and hawala, which is a credit transfer, helped facilitate trade. However, some of these instruments were structured in ways that closely resembled riba. One example is the practice of bay al-ina, or sale and buyback. A merchant in Baghdad could sell an item on credit and later buy it back at a lower cash price. While technically a trade transaction, critics argued that this was just a disguised form of interest. One of the key figures in this debate was the famous jurist Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanafi school of law. Abu Hanifa allowed certain credit-based transactions as long as they were structured as sales rather than direct loans. If an extra charge was linked to the risk of trade, it was profit, not riba. However, scholars like Ibn Hanbal took a much stricter approach, rejecting any form of delayed payment with an added cost, arguing that it ultimately led to riba. This legal debate would shape Islamic finance for centuries. The Abbasid government also engaged in financial practices that bordered on riba. For example, the Diwan al-Kharaj, which was the tax administration, often borrowed money from private financiers to cover state expenses, repaying them later with added benefits. Some argued that these payments were merely gifts rather than interest, but critics saw it differently. The Ottoman Empire, which ruled for over 600 years, faced enormous financial challenges, especially in its later years. Despite being an Islamic empire, the Ottomans engaged in transactions that many Islamic scholars would have classified as riba. One of the most controversial Ottoman financial innovations was the cash waqf system. Traditionally, waqfs, which are charitable endowments, involved donating real estate or land to fund public services like mosques and schools. But in the 15th century, the Ottomans introduced a new practice, allowing people to donate cash, which was then lent out at a fixed return. Many scholars, including Ebu Effendi, the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire, defended this practice, arguing that as long as the money was used for public benefit and the returns were considered service charges rather than interest, it did not count as riba. However, critics like Ibn Abidin, a later Hanafi jurist, saw this as a clear loophole and warned that it opened the door to widespread usury. In the 19th century, the Ottomans borrowed heavily from European banks, many of which charged high interest rates. By 1875, nearly half of the Ottoman Empire's revenue was used to pay off interest on its debt. Sultans justified this by arguing that borrowing was necessary for survival, and some used the concept of darura, which translates to necessity, to permit these transactions. But conservative scholars remained vocal against it, fearing that it would weaken the empire's Islamic identity. So, what can we learn from history? Despite the strict Islamic prohibition on riba, financial realities often forced Islamic empires to find ways around it. Some, like the Umayyads, allowed non-Muslims to handle money lending. Others, like the Abbasids, used creative legal contracts to justify it. And the Ottomans institutionalized financial practices that blurred the line between lawful trade and riba. These debates are still relevant today. Modern Islamic finance is built on the ideas and arguments that emerged from these periods. So, do you think the solutions used in the past were justified? Or did they compromise the very principles they sought to uphold? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Islamic history and finance, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content.